Hey, all of you RPGers, terrain builders, mini painters, mini printers, Dalen with another random making an encounter, and it's good to see you back. Today we're going to talk about 3D model orientation for resin printing. We're going to look at two pieces of software. The first one is Z Suite by Zortrax, and the reason we're going to look at Z Suite is twofold. I really want you to be aware that there are a lot of tools out there that are getting better and that have some pretty advanced features. Z Suite is free. And I think that the state of software is only going to improve and get better. So we should be kind of keeping our eyes out for what's going on. The other thing is it just has a couple features that I really like. It is not my primary tool, but it is something that I have as a way to help me out when I start to get stuck. So let's talk about what that looks like. So I'm going to grab that Tiefling Blade Master file, and here's where the unstuckness comes in. Rotation optimization. I'm going to click yes, because why would I not want the software to figure things out for me? I'm going to say yes. What this is doing is it is going and it's analyzing the model, and it's using some AI clever algorithms to determine what it thinks the best rotation is for the model. So I'm not doing this manually. I'm not guessing. That's awesome. And that I would love to see this continue to improve in its power, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, there are three options. Maximum platform contact. We're going to talk a little bit about why that's not super ideal. But minimum support area is a good one. If I click that, you can see that it rotates the model, and we'll talk about why it did what it did in another piece of software when we do it manually. But it rotates the model in a fairly predictable way. This makes a lot of sense. Mixed is a combination of platform contact and support area. If I click mixed, we get a slightly different rotation. So you can see here the blade is over the body. That's actually, just looking at it, I can tell that's less than ideal. It's going to drop a lot of supports onto the model itself instead of onto the platform or onto the plate. And that's really not good for this particular model. So mixed already starts to look pretty good. The blades are starting, the arms are starting to get clear of the rest of the model. So we're going to roll with that, and we're going to jump over to the support tab, and we're going to just throw in some light supports and see how it does. So these are all presets. So basically I'm 2 or 3 clicks into rotating and supporting the model. Now if we zoom in, I'm not the fastest with the adjusting of views in this. If we zoom in, we can see that it did a pretty good job. There's a lot of good things going on. One of the things I do really love about this software is how it places supports. They are very even. And this is sort of maybe because it's a little compulsive of me, but it doesn't really matter where supports get dropped to the plate, but the way that Z Suite actually does it is really clean, super elegant, and I just love sort of the precision and the evenness of the support structures. And so it did a pretty good job of clearing things away from the model. There's not a ton that's really necessary on the front of it, but there are a bunch of things still that would be very problematic with this particular figure. Now, Z Suite, the software doesn't know that this is a figure. It doesn't know this is a face. It is literally just looking at geometry, so we can't fault the software for what it's doing. It's giving us an optimal solution based on its calculation. So the eyes here is kind of a non-starter, and the arm is less than ideal, but it's a good starting point. So I could continue to use this software as the rest of my workflow. I would go back and I would begin to tweak the orientation a little bit until I kind of resolved some of these areas. I'm going to show you how to do that manually in another piece of software, but what I'm pointing out with this is you could use this tool all the way through from file to print. The one thing I use it for is when I'm really struggling with orientation on a complex model and I'm not really sure how to approach it. I let that algorithm sort of guide me. Now, how could this be better? Well, if you're listening, folks at Z Suite or other pieces, other software developers, really what we need is an ability to maybe come over here, grab a paintbrush, and paint on our model areas that are important, areas that we want to avoid having a support straight through an eyeball or into the mouth or all around the ear. So I would want to be able to sort of paint to protect these areas. And then one of the key elements of the algorithm would be to look at minimizing support structures in those important areas, obviously making sure that the areas are adequately supported, and then do the rest of its rotation and optimization after that. So preserving areas becomes an important part of our auto rotation. So we're going to jump now out of Z Suite, but I wanted to share this with you and show you that there are some tools out there that are doing some pretty slick things, and this gets us really close. Now, if this model were a little bit simpler, this really could be a 2 or 3 click sort of process, and we could let auto orientation, auto support guide us all the way through, and we could be done. So, cool tool, worth checking out. Now we're in some software that should be just like coming home to many of us. This is Chitubox. I think it's pronounced that way. I don't think there's like a sh sound or a sound to it. Post a comment. Let me know if I'm saying that right. I'd love to resolve that. You know, it's the GIF versus GIF dilemma. You know, you just really don't know what side you're going to come down on. Okay, let's take a look at Chitubox. This is really that software that is ubiquitous. Everyone seems to use it. It's readily available, and it comes with many, many printers. So we're going to drag our tiefling onto our platform, and we're going to talk really quickly 60,000 foot view about what supports are really doing. I've got a video that's a little bit deeper dive, that's why prints fail, but in this case, let's talk about what supports do for us. In a nutshell, they anchor the model to the printing plate, the platform, so that as the platform lifts, it pulls that freshly printed layer away from the Teflon film, that is that exposure layer, freeing up space for more resin to flow in and the next exposure to take place. And it just builds layer upon layer. Now, what that means is that there needs to be an attachment point. Every little bit, every little floaty needs to either be attached generally from a continuous or contiguous, I don't know what the right word is there, part of the model, or there needs to be a support structure that anchors it to the plate or anchors it to the model, to an already printed part of the model, that allows for that mechanical lift to take place so that it is being pulled free of that print surface, or lifted from that print surface, and doesn't just end up being a blob of resin that kind of pools and continues to grow. That's called a print fail. And so there needs to be mechanical attachment. Now, what that also means, the second thing, is that those mechanical attachment points need to be strong enough to pull that print layer away from the Teflon film. Now, Teflon's pretty non-stick, but due to the viscosity, the viscousness, I don't even know if that's a word. I just like saying that, the viscosity of the resin, and that varies. Depending on your surface area that you've cured, there is sort of a suction, there's a resistance to pulling that up and pulling that away. You're creating sort of a vacuum, a suction where fluids need to flow in and under. So there can be a fair amount of resistance to that lift. So as your models get bigger and your surface area increases, you need to start putting more robust supports in. It's not to actually physically, it's easy to think of supports as being something that holds it up. It's actually supports are things that allow the print layers to be pulled away from. So a couple little, finer points on that. Now, that means that we do need to make sure they're strong and they're connected. Now, model orientation then is all about making that happen, but at the same time, protecting the areas that we don't want to get sort of gummed up and gunked up with a lot of supports where we have to go and do a lot of cleanup. If cleanup wasn't an issue, we could just auto support all day long and just call it a day. Now, looking at our tiefling, we talked a little bit in Z Suite about why just maximum platform contact is maybe not ideal. I'm going to use a slightly different model to talk about this, one that might be tempting to just drop it on the platform and print it. This little ogler is a very kind of weird and gross model. Painted up this I haven't painted this one up yet, but could be very, very cool. It's got a lot of just cool geometry. It's very blobby. It doesn't really have a lot of overhanging requirements, so I might just be tempted to drop it flat on the platform and print it. Now, there are going to be two things that are going to happen with our ogler. Thing one is probably the more panic-inducing of the two, and that is that I may not be able to easily remove this from the print platform. In fact, I may reach a point where I'd either have to damage the model or potentially damage the platform. And the reason for this is the initial printing layers are generally overcured, overexposed. The goal for those initial layers is firm adhesion to the printing surface. And so the exposures are usually in the 60-second range. It's pretty normal, right? Default setting 60 seconds, when a normal print layer might be 6 to 10 seconds. So that's really baking that sucker on there. And in this case, by the time it's done printing, this would be even hollowed, a fairly monolithic chunk of resin, and it would be very, very firmly adhered to the print bed, to the point where you would maybe question at one point if it's ever going to come off. So that's bad. That's not a good day when you have something permanently affixed to your print plate. It's the opposite of having prints fail because they fall off. The other thing that you would find, which will pale by comparison, is that the print quality along the bottom edge would be kind of poor. And that's because it's basically overexposing on those first initial layers. So you're going to get a lot of light leakage. You're going to get a lot of bleeding. So it's not a lot. It's really poor print quality along the bottom. However, that would be your temptation. It's super simple. Why support it? Doesn't really need anything. Now, how would I solve for that for our little ogler here? If I go over to my supports, I would probably try just popping up and adding supports from the platform and doing something like this. Now, Dayland, it actually looks like there's more surface area on the supports, and you're telling me that why can I scrape this one off and I can't scrape it off when I just drop it straight on? Well, twofold. Great question, but really where it comes down to is that it has a lot to do with material flexibility. And leverage. It's all about the leverage. If we look at this, there's a nice little bevel that is inherent in these platforms, and those are creating a space for you to get the scraper under. So it's giving you the ability to create a lever. Also, these are just a few layers thick, and so with combination of the support structures being these little fingers and bends and tapers, you're creating a very flexible base. And so you're able to get your scraper under it, lever it up, and then really just peel it back across the length of this attachment point. Whereas if you drop it just straight to the platform, you're looking at a very rigid surface, and you would literally have to be releasing the entire surface at once. It's a slightly different it's a physics problem, a little bit of a different physics problem. You're releasing more surface area at once as opposed to peeling back across it and only releasing small portions at a time. So leverage is kind of the answer to that. My takeaway here is be very careful when you're tempted to just drop things straight onto the print plate. You won't get the same quality, but the bigger concern is you're going to end up with something sort of permanently affixed, and you may damage you will definitely probably damage the model. You probably will run the risk of scraping up your print platform. Now, again, if this is tiny, maybe that isn't quite the same thing. Smaller surface area, easier to remove. Okay, let's get rid of our ogler here. Ogler. And let's get back to our tiefling. Okay, now with the tiefling, we're going to start working on general rotation, and we're going to look at, when we looked at what Z Suite did, it actually got us really close. So, let's mimic that a little bit, but let's talk through why it did what it did. My general approach is, if we think about the approach, it's rotate and clear is kind of the best way to think about it. Rotate and clear. So I'm going to rotate the model to some degree, and I'm going to make sure I'm trying to clear areas so that I don't have overlapping shapes. Make sure that things are clearing the body of the model and allowing supports to be dropped to the platform. So if we look at this tiefling and I bring the rotation, these don't have to be super precise numbers. Generally in the 20 to 45-ish sort of range. You don't want to start to get too flat in many ways, but sort of in the 20, 30, 40 degrees, sort of like that, just kind of eyeballing it. There's a lot of angles here. So 45 relative to what is kind of the point here. Now I've rotated, great. Now what I need to do next is clear these areas. So looking down on the model, I will look down on the model and start to see where things are sort of overlapping and may cause problems. I can also look at it sort of from this end on. I'm going to use that for my rotation. I'm going to rotate it. I'm going to bring it around and start to clear those arms away from the body. And you can see this is already looking very much like what Z Suite was doing. It was rotating and clearing for us. Okay, so now at this point I might say, and again, this is just manual eyeballing it. So I might say, okay, that looks good. Let's just throw some light supports in. These are all, again, keeping currently all default settings. Now, there are a lot of people that are going to say you can really optimize them here, but again, you've got a lot of variables here, and I'm going to trust that the folks at Chitubox, we're sticking with that name, are going to give us, they're not going to steer us too wrong for what they think are optimum. They've got more experience than I do, so I'm going to do a little bit of trust here. All. And again, now we can see it's not terrible. It's actually better out of the gate than the Zortrax. Now, it could be better out of the gate because it really should have a support here, but they're kind of being like, well, maybe we really don't need one here. Or my guess may have just generated some geometry that's a little bit better. But it's actually not too terrible. I don't have anything really in the face. This is kind of sort of just dumb luck. I have a little bit of stuff back here on the ear and the neck, but it's not terrible. The only thing that I don't love about this is the supports on the blade. However, this is actually not bad. So what I would do is I would go back here. I would drag this one over, just tuck it aside, save it. It's not terrible. I would clone it. And I would recommend that this be part of your process too. Print multiples. Try different orientations and rotations to print multiples, because resin costs, unless you're using like gold filled resin costs are pretty, I wonder if that'd be kind of cool, but crazy. Time is your investment. Resin costs are actually pretty minimal in the grand scheme of things. So you don't want to have one model, print it for 3 hours, and find that it didn't work. It'd be better to print 3 models, find that 2 didn't work, but you got 1 out of it. And then you can learn from what works and what doesn't work, and you've got some compare and contrast. So I'm going to clone it. I'm going to come over. I'm going to remove some things here. And I'm going to actually try and get rid of those supports on the arm. Now, it's one way I could do it is to try to maybe rotate the blade out more so that it is the supports could run straight down to the plate. My concern about that is, though, I really like what was sort of not happening in the face with a lot of supports, and so I feel like my face, the rotation, I don't want to get this face rotated too far away from sort of this vertical. So what I'm going to do is, in order to maybe try and get rid of those supports on the blade, another way I can approach that is to tip it a little bit more vertical. So generally speaking, if you think about it, as we're printing vertically up from the plate, things that are generally vertically oriented don't need as many supports. So I'm going to go back and I'm just going to tip it up just a tiniest little bit and see if that makes a difference. Hit all again, and yes. So that was it. Again, once you get something close, you generally speaking now are in sort of subtle, tiny adjustments to try and focus on some areas that could be that are less than ideal. So now in this case, we haven't looked at the other side of the model. I don't know if I've created other problems, but I did solve for supports on the arm. And so that is good. Now let's rotate it around. I'm still free and clear. There's a little bit of stuff coming back on the bottom part of this ear. Whoa, super zoom there. Sorry about that. Oh, that was just like inducing of some sort of thing. There's a little bit coming in here, but this is super tucked away, and it's kind of would be a little bit hard, kind of getting in there to sand that little nubbin down, but it's fairly hidden. And this is actually looking quite nice. Now, I'm never going to get rid of things that are sort of underneath the model. This is a tough one because of this stance, but things like the coins will never really be able to fix too much. It's nice that we've got a couple points that are reaching in from, but we've got enough stuff going on here that these are really tough to really get rid of completely. Plain bases, to be honest with you, a lot of times, or no bases are nice, and then you base it later. It allows you to not have to worry so much about what's going on here. So, note to self to maybe slice the base off of this one, or save it out of Hero Forge without a base, and then see where we go from printing there. I might actually save myself some grief there. But this looks really pretty good. Now I have to trust that it's putting supports where it needs it. That isn't necessarily true. There still may be areas where we end up with minor print fails, but generally my experience with this software is if I'm using generally auto settings and I am trusting in those auto support settings, I get generally good results. Now, when you start to monkey with these, you start to adjust these, what happens is you could end up, remember, one of the things we talked about is it has to be rigid enough to support the pulling away. It has to be structurally sound enough. When you start to adjust these values, you are actually now adjusting the amount of support or the amount of attachment and the geometry of these. So you could start to create support structures that are physically not strong enough. And then that's where you can end up with much more dramatic failures as well. So defaults work fairly well for me. So in this case, I would come over, I'd do a little layout cleanup just to get them centered. I might even do one more. I think I could fit 3 onto this print run. I could do one back in the corner and one in the middle and sort of free up some space. But in this case, I'm pretty happy with both of these. I don't think I need to really do anything more dramatic. And I think I would probably get something pretty usable out of it. So in this case, I would actually call this done and good to go. So basic principle is rotate and clear, right? And that's where we actually got some success. Now, what happens when we've got a much more difficult model, even more so than this tiefling? And so let's look at something like that. I know these are great. These actually worked out better than I could have hoped. This Grick. Now this is an awesome model. It's available, I think, on Thingiverse. I have a painted version of this on my Instagram page. I didn't paint it right. I painted it like a plant because it kind of looks, I think I was very Rocky Horror on it. And they're actually like gray wormy things. They're a little more Resident Evil, but it looked cool. It's just the wrong colors, you know. Nice job, Dalen. This brick is tough because it's got a lot of curved shapes that curve back on itself. And it's a challenging one to support. So if we look at this from our general rotate and clear sort of philosophy, if I rotate it back to some amount, and then I look at that actually kind of does both. It does actually clear a lot of the arms, and we've rotated it back, and that's kind of our starting point, right? Okay, cool. Let's go and do our test and fix. Okay, so when this happens, and I end up with things where I'm like, okay, that sucks. Not what I want. And what's sucking here is there's stuff in the mouth. There's stuff down in here. All of these things are kind of coming down onto the little sucker points. It's just not ideal. There's just too much going on the surface of it. I would look at, okay, well, my clearing didn't really help. So where am I still not clearing? And if we look at the model, all of this shape comes up and then it comes back on itself. And so this is where we're getting a lot of issues. It's just coming back on itself. So we've got a big, massive sort of overlap of geometry here. So rather than being sort of stuck in one way of thinking, we're still going to apply the same principles. But what we're going to do is we're going to really over-rotate. We're going to bring it so that instead of it being sort of a face up, it's base up. And so we don't want to put the face of the brick down to the plate, the platform, because that just means all of those supports get plopped right on it. But what I want you to be thinking about is, can I rotate this in sort of a way thinking more holistically of the model itself? So in this case, I'm trying to free up this inner area here. So it looks more like the U-bend of a sink. Now I don't have to worry about this being sort of this mass being supported. It's a little unusual because the base is up. This isn't how I would traditionally think about it. But it also actually does a better job of clearing a lot of the tentacles from the rest of the body. So let's take a look and see what that does. Okay, so better. If we look at this, there's nothing in the mouth anymore. There's a little bit of stuff going on in this tentacle right here. And, I might fiddle with that just a little bit to see if I could fix that. There's one over here as well. But a lot of this has to do with the fact that as we think about islands, these layers, as you follow that black line coming up, where that tip of that claw is on the left here, right in this area, if I zoom in, you can see it's really going to be a little unsupported island right there. So that is, in this particular orientation, unavoidable that it needs a support there. What we're trying to think about is there a way I can make it so that support goes to the base and not to the tentacle or the little arm below it? Realistically, maybe not. And so I have a couple options. Option one is to rotate the model so that this is actually flatter and it isn't sort of this low point on that point. Or I could just sort of be happy with it being what it is and do a little bit of cleanup. So what I'm going to do is I will follow my normal process of, we'll just save this one. We'll clone it because that worked out pretty well. And I'm going to remove the supports on this one. And I don't know. I don't want to rotate it more to sort of destroy my little U-bend action here. What I might look at is, I don't know, I might try and do a little bit of rotation and something like, I don't know if this is going to make it better, a little bit like this, just rotate it a little clockwise. Now, when you're rotating, after you've already rotated along one axis and you go back and you rotate along a second one, you might find that it's going to mildly change this. So I want to go back here and make sure that I didn't really mess up that U-bend geometry too much. It tends to flatten out a little bit. So I want to make sure that that is looking good as well. We'll go back, we'll throw some supports in. And you know, I don't know if this is kind of better or worse. I may have actually been able now to free up and get these coming from the platform. And so that's actually, yeah, you can see here how these are connected down onto the tentacle. And it looks like now over here, they're on the platform. I still have a little cleanup here, but I've saved myself a little work here. And, you know, there's still something over here. I'm never going to get this perfect, but the second one is probably, of the two, my preferred. Now, should I just print this one? Heck no, because realistically, we're assuming that everything is good to go. And the reality is that there will probably still be areas here that are unsupported. Now, the only way really at that point to fix them is to go layer by layer, use some software that's available to analyze the model based on the slices, and it identifies unsupported islands. So it goes and it does a quality control check on the output of the slicer. That is extremely time consuming and mind numbing, and I have zero interest in doing that. Now it's out there, it's available, but I want this to be as click, plug and play, pour and print as possible. So I am willing to have some minor flaws, some minor fails within the print, rather than having to spend a day or a half a day on sort of debugging my slices. So I trust a lot to the software to get the results I need. And generally speaking, like I said, I've had very good success following these processes, looking at the models, and just really not messing with things too much and hitting print. Both of these look good to me, and I would print both. And hopefully from this, I would get either two perfectly usable models, or I would get one that is better than the other, and that's the one that I would paint up. This looks like a good place to stop. If this was helpful, please hit that like button. Subscribe to my channel. There's a link to my Instagram at the end where there is a version of this printed and painted brick. I really do appreciate you watching my videos. As a creator and a maker, it's really about community. So comments are always welcome as well. I try to respond to as many as quickly as possible. And we'll see you back really soon with another random making encounter.